So I've got a story to read you guys, just because I didn't think I could get through without writing it first. So I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about Walt's life. I know a lot of you know him, but just so you know, those of you that don't know him or don't know things about him. First of all, thank you so much for being here today. I mean, that walk up and down the street was just amazing. So. It's amazing to look out at everyone here and see so many representations of his life, right? From old friends to new friends to family from all around the country. And we're so glad you guys are here to celebrate with us. Some of you have traveled a really long distance. Some of you have walked a very short distance to be here. It's a tribute to how much Walter had an impact, just not on his life, but so much of this Redondo Beach community. We've had a lot of conversations over the last 2 years. His dad was battling cancer, and not all of them were easy. When it came around how he wanted today to go, his answer was crystal clear. Walt wanted a jazz funeral, right here on Pullman Lane, with all of you celebrating his life, not mourning his death. Dad, I hope you're enjoying this day and soaking all the love that we have for you. So, a couple memories that hopefully you'll all enjoy hearing. Once I'm done, anyone else that wants to come up and share a memory or two, we would love to have you talk. We're hoping to maybe get that done in about half an hour, just because we're probably running out of light here. So, you know, keep your stories succinct, but please, if you have something you want to share about Walter, please come on up. All right, here goes. So, Walter Coe Jr. was born on September the 12th, 1944, to Walter Sr. and Catherine at Baptist Hospital in New Orleans, Louisiana. He had a big sister, Barbara, who was 6 when he was born. A few months after he was born, Walter Sr. left, and Catherine was left raising Barbara and Walter on her own. A very few hard years later, Catherine met Lionel DeRoche, and they fell in love and got married in 1949. A few years later, Lionel and Catherine had a son, Lionel Jr., and they raised their happy family of 5 on Clematis Street in the heart of the Irish Channel of NOLA. Dad never had a relationship with his biological dad, but he had a fantastic relationship with Lionel, who he considered his true father. I believe this had a significant impact on my dad, because he saw the impact of 2 different kinds of fathers as a kid. He had memories as a young boy being in a family with a father that had abandoned them. Then he has these amazing memories of being in this happy home with a truly loving father that he loved and admired greatly. Being a good dad, and then later being an amazing grandfather, was something he absolutely patterned off of Lionel. When I was a kid, I remember being confused going to a courthouse to witness Lionel officially adopting Walter on his own son. I never even knew that Lionel was wasn't his real father. And let me be clear, there was no doubt to my dad who his real father was, but officially documenting their relationship as father and son was very important to both of them. Dad grew up in the 1950s, going to St. Stephen's Catholic School through 8th grade. As a boy, Walter enjoyed Boy Scouts. By the way, did anyone see his Boy Scout trophy from 1953? That's crazy. I think you threw all my trophies away, right? And just so you guys know, it was a really big trash bag. He liked to play sports, he loved to ride his bike, and he loved fishing with his dad. In 1958, Walter started high school at Redemptress High. At Redemptress, students were divided into 2 groups, those that were being prepped for college and those that weren't. Walter was a good student and was put on the college prep path. In his freshman year, he befriended 2 kids that were also on the college prep path, Leo Bevon and Wayne Warner. Leo, where are you at? Deuce McAllister over here, number 26. They maintained their friendships for their entire lives. And Leo in particular had a rather large impact on Walter's life. His freshman year, Walter played football, but didn't get much playing time because he was so little and skinny. How's that for irony? They certainly fattened him up over the years. But he developed a love of the game that grew into a passion and eventually exploded into fanaticism. In 1962, Walter enrolled in college at Louisiana State University in New Orleans, now known as UNO, as a chemistry major. Well, chemistry and Walter did not mix. And after one semester, he changed his major to psychology. In 1963, he was eating in the cafeteria when news about John F. Kennedy being shot was broadcasted. JFK left a huge impact on both my parents' lives, but Walter, being a 19-year-old young liberal in southeast Louisiana, spent a lot of time pondering what he could do to support his community. A few years later, Leo invites Dad to go to a fraternity party, which Dad wasn't terribly interested in going, mostly because he didn't have a date. Well, Leo says, well, I have this cousin who you should come meet, and Walter and Linda go on their first date to a fraternity frat party. I also thought, when Walter comes to the door to pick her up, Linda vividly remembers his dark, handsome man with a gorgeous smile, wearing white shorts and a red shirt, and she instantly fell in love. So did Walter. The first date went well, and for the second date, they agreed to double date again and go to the movies. But there was an issue at the movie, so they improvised and decided to go to the racetrack instead. I'd still love to know the true story behind that one. There's only one problem. Linda's parents, Lenny and Maggie, were regulars at the track, especially over the weekend. So Linda makes Leo promise that no matter what, he have to avoid their parents at all costs. They walk in, and this couple is going batshit crazy over some horse about to win a race. And sure enough, Leo sees him and walks up and says, "Hello, Aunt Margaret." And their double date instantly became a triple date. So they settle in, and Walter sits next to Maggie, and they start talking and exchanging information on the horses. And of course, Maggie falls instantly in love with Walter as well. Maggie, excuse me. Maggie, that's right. I even wrote Maggie. Walter made an exacta bet, which is basically a bet that you pick over multiple races, but being kids wanted to get away from their parents, they didn't stay for the whole race. So they go out later in the evening. Walter is walking Linda back to the door to drop her off. Linda's hopefully waiting for a kiss goodnight. And just as they're walking up to the porch, the lights come on, and Maggie runs out waving $200 because Walter won his exacta bet. And everyone in the whole group is happy except for Linda, who did not get her goodnight kiss. At least on that night. After they leave, Maggie looks at Linda and says, "That's the man you're going to marry." She knew. My dad grew up in a home and a family that was stereotypical 1950s Americana, with love, order, and dignity. My mom, however, grew up in a home that was pure chaos. Having 8 Italian Catholic Southern children clearly created an environment where the inmates ran the asylum. And all of a sudden, and they're proud of it, all of a sudden this handsome, sweet, and kind man appears in this crazy lives, and Linda isn't the only LaGrange that falls in love with him. Maggie and Lenny were clearly charmed from the start, their first encounter at the track. For Ginger, she talked about how Walter was the first man that treated her like an adult instead of a condescending little lady. Mary, the youngest, was a young girl, and whenever Walt was over, she would run up and sit right between Linda and Walter because she wanted to get her some Walter time. Skip and Rick clearly adored my dad, and their love of sports came from their soon-to-be brother-in-law. Walt just had something about him that made everyone like him instantly. I'm sure you all know about that. While they were dating, Walter became the managing editor of UNO's school newspaper, the Driftwood. At the time, UNO was a commuter school and didn't have an athletics program. Can you imagine how boring it must be to work for a school newspaper and not have an athletic program to report on? So Walter helps to establish a committee to get a football team together. They round up a bunch of students that had played in high school, borrowed gear and equipment from all the local high schools, and ultimately competed against Loyola at the Lakefront Sports Union. Now, according to Linda, it wasn't much of a competition as Loyola kicked the shit out of UNO. But that game gave the students something to cheer for and became the beginning of the UNO athletics program. Today, UNO has 12 men's and women's NCAA athletic programs.
Yeah!
What are they, the Privateers?
Yes, the
Go
Privateers.
The summer after Linda's senior of high school, her and Walter are madly in love and inseparable. She decides that instead of going to nursing school, she's going to enroll at UNO to pursue her MRS degree. Think about it. That was actually your dad's best line, not mine. Walter and Linda spend their time doing what all serious, studious college students do, blowing off class to go make out on the lakefront. The first semester doesn't go well, and both end up flunking out. And for Walter, not being in college made him eligible for the draft to go to Vietnam. So instead of waiting to be drafted, Walt decides to enlist in the U.S. Marine Reserves. He delays his deployment until later in the summer in 1966 so he can stand as the best man for his other good friend from high school, Wayne Warner. The next day after that wedding, Walter is shipped to San Diego for basic training. After 9 weeks of basic training, he was then stationed at Camp Pendleton for infantry training. While he was there, the Marines discovered that Walter in high school worked as a lifeguard. So they made him in charge of drown-proofing young Marines getting ready to be shipped off to Vietnam. Most of those young men that he trained ended up fighting in Vietnam, and too many of them lost their lives. Dad's military experience had a huge impact on who he was, and as eventually did the time he spent as a young man in Southern California. It's fitting that he died the day before Veterans Day, because he always had a huge place in his heart for those that served our country. There have been numerous times where he and I were together, and he would see a young man dressed in fatigues, and we'd walk up to shake his hand and say thank you for his service, because you guys know how shy my dad was. A few months ago, our friend John Forbes, John, where are you at? It's right over here. John was collecting business suits for young men that needed a suit to interview for jobs after serving their country. Walter donated every suit he had, and he felt so much honor in helping those young men that could hopefully wear that suit and get a job to rebuild their lives. Walt was also a huge history buff, especially military history. He loved the World War II Museum in New Orleans, spent time on the beaches in Normandy when he was traveling through France, and he loved reading historic novels, especially Tom Clancy. My dad was probably the most un-Marine of any Marine you've ever met, but he was also terribly proud of his service to his country. After serving his time, Walt re-enrolled back in UNO without the distraction of Linda hanging around, and finished taking all of the classes necessary to get his psychology degree. They decided to get married after he was done with school, and on January 20th, 1968, 50 years ago next month, Walter married the love of his life, Linda. Their wedding was at St. Matthew's Church, with the reception held at Margaret and Leonard's house on Suzanne Drive. After the wedding, they got in the car and they headed to Atlanta for their honeymoon, but stopped to spend the night in Mobile, Alabama. For you true sports fans out there, you may also remember January the 20th, 1968, as the college basketball game of the century, featuring the undefeated UCLA Bruins and their 47-game winning streak versus the Houston Cougars for the NCAA championship. This was the first college basketball game ever broadcast nationwide in prime time, and really became the start of what is March Madness today. And there wasn't a way Walter was going to miss this game to end the honeymoon or not. Elvin Hayes and the Houston Cougars scored a huge upset over Lou Alcindor's UCLA Bruins that night, and Walter and Linda started their married life sitting on a bed of a hotel room in Mobile, Alabama, watching a TV game, a basketball game. If you didn't know, you knew at that point in time, Walter was a huge sports fan. In February 1969, Walter and Linda became parents as I was born in February. Elizabeth followed 19 months later, and our family was complete. Dad was working odd jobs at the time for different sales for grocery and pharmaceutical companies, but in 1971 he got a job selling cars for Royal Oldsmobile and began a very long career in automotive industry. But selling cars was tough in the 70s as the oil crisis equally affected both the auto industry and the Louisiana economy. Tired of not making enough money but wanting to stay with the royal family, he transferred to the service department and eventually earned the job of service manager. Walt was a natural. And people have always told my mom that Dad was the greatest boss they ever had. He was patient, he was kind, and he truly cared about people, and that made him such a great boss and an ideal match for that job. I had the pleasure of working for Walter twice, both at an Acura dealership and one of his Speedy oil change franchises. And the way he could take a completely pissed off customer and instantly disarm them and de-escalate the situation with charm and kindness was magical. Dad truly had a gift of connecting with all kinds of people and was a savant at customer service. Did I mention my dad was a sports fan? While he loved his Angels, football was a sport and no team was bigger in his life than the New Orleans Saints. Walt was an original season ticket holder, starting at Tulane Stadium, then the Superdome. He was there when John Gilliam returned the opening kickoff of the Saints franchise for a TD against the LA Rams. And for years, the joke was, it was all downhill from there. He was there when Tom Dempsey kicked a 62-yard field goal to beat the Lions.
You were too.
I was too. I don't remember it, but I was there. He was also there back in the Aints days. Before the Cleveland Browns, the Saints were the laughingstock of the NFL, with fans wearing bags on their heads to games. Win or lose, his support of the Saints never wavered and eventually was rewarded. Dad, Skip, and I, we were at the Superdome in 2006 when the Saints returned after Hurricane Katrina had devastated the city of New Orleans. We got to witness Steve Gleason's block punt against the Falcons and be part of 75,000 people simultaneously cheering and crying at the same time. And of course, when the Saints finally reached the pinnacle of the NFL, when Tracy Porter intercepted Peyton Manning's pass for the game-winning TD to clinch the Super Bowl, Walter, Linda, and I were sitting together on our sofa celebrating with many of you with equal parts laughter and tears.
Who dat?
Who dat?
Who dat?
Who dat?
By the time the 80s rolled around, Walter and Linda were looking for a change. They had a couple of possibilities within the royal families in the Southeast, but none of it really ever came together. But there was an ex-employee that had moved out to California and had always told Dad to call him if he was ever looking for a job. Remembering his time in California with the Marines, Dad flew out and interviewed, and in 1981 landed a job with the Oldsmobile dealership in Cerritos. So we headed out west and relocated to Cypress, California. West Coast living was certainly an adjustment, but our family thrived in California. Linda and Walt quickly made friends, as most parents do, through their kids' friends and their parents. Between football, basketball, baseball, gymnastics, cheerleading, there were plenty of activities to support, and support they did. Dad was a constant at our games, always with an encouraging word and never with a critical eye. In 1988, the year after Elizabeth graduated from high school, Dad decided he was tired of working for the man and became the man himself. He bought a Speedy oil change franchise in Corona, and then later a second location in Barstow. Those years were both the best of times and the worst of times for he and my mom, as the demands of running a business and managing a staff became overwhelming. But he loved taking care of both clients and employees alike. In 1997, they sold both of the locations, and Dad took a job eventually at Quality Toyota in Corona, which is where he retired from in 2010. He decided to pursue something he had always dreamed of doing, becoming an usher for the Angels. Dad loved being a part of the Angel family and felt more like a part of the team versus just a fan. It also afforded him the time he needed to do what he enjoyed more than anything, being a grandfather. Now, most of you here know Walter through his support of St. John and Trey's numerous football, baseball, volleyball, and band performances. Walt wasn't just the grandfather that showed up to every game. He was there for most practices, even more than Allen Iverson. And not just here in Cali. He and Linda also spent a lot of time in Seattle supporting Kyler and Sienna in their athletic and theater performances. He was a passionate supporter of his grandchildren. And he was never happier than sitting in the stands or the audience watching them perform. Now sometimes, we'd have to tap him on the shoulder and remind him that this was youth sports, not an NFL football game. A bad call or a kid missing an assignment could make him apoplectic, and with his booming voice and sarcastic wit, we would have to tell him these were just volunteer referees and didn't deserve that kind of wrath. But no matter the outcome, he was always there at the end of the game with a good game, with a hug, and probably a bag of cut-up pineapple. To all of you that were involved in so many of those moments, and I know a lot of you here today, Walter truly loves spending time cheering with you, talking with you, and celebrating you or your children's accomplishments. So thank you for being here for him. Some of you also know Walter as the commish. Walter's love of football made him a perfect fit for fantasy football. For nearly 20 years, Walter was an avid fantasy football player, usually with a losing team chocked full of Saints players. He became the commissioner 10 years ago and was a natural for the job, which mostly included settling silly disputes over contested free agent pickups and unbalanced trades. But much like his time dealing with customers on the service aisle, he was able to disarm and find a solution to keep everyone playing together in peace and harmony. This year, we renamed our fantasy league Walter's Special Needs League in honor of his years of leadership and us being completely brats the whole time he was commissioner. He loved the name of that league, and he will continue to be a part of it forever. 2 years ago, Walter started losing weight rapidly, and tests eventually confirmed that he had pancreatic cancer. Pancreatic cancer is a terrible diagnosis and virtually incurable. In the last few years, Dad has endured a very complex surgery to remove a large portion of his digestive tract, multiple rounds of chemotherapy, and radiation. And I don't have to tell all of you how sick he's been because most of you have seen it. But while his body was failing, his spirit never did. Whenever we'd ask him how he was doing, he would always say, "I've been better, but I've been worse." He certainly had many dark moments as the eventual outcome of the cancer became apparent, but he didn't let it ruin his life. I won't spend too much time talking about his courage through battling cancer, since St. John is going to read you something next that he wrote that expresses it far more eloquently than I ever could. Walter embraced each moment that he had all the way to the end, including one last trip up to Seattle, which seems like just a few weeks ago, to visit Kyler and Sienna and Elizabeth and Sean and watch Kyler play a high school football game. But perhaps his best day during his battle with cancer was this year's Pullman Lane crawfish boil. 10 years ago, Dad and I had the idea of doing a crawfish boil on Memorial Day. It started with 50 of us in this park, hanging out, picking at a few mud bugs, as most of you had no idea what a crawfish was. From there, this party has grown into hundreds of people and hundreds of pounds of crawfish. This whole block closed. And 2 years ago, Dad had just had the surgery on his digestive tract, and he was so sick he had to leave early. He couldn't even be here to enjoy it. But this year, I think Walt sensed that this was his last boil, and he enjoyed every minute of it. At one point, Brooke's boss, Catherine, arrived, and she had never eaten a crawfish before. So I walked her over to her table, we grabbed a tray of crawfish, and I started demonstrating the technique. A few minutes later, Dad joined us. So I decided she was in great hands, and I took off to enjoy other matters. Later that day, Catherine tells Brooke that during their time together, dozens of people would walk up to the table and say hi to the Godfather. And she was blown away at the interaction of his spirit in our community. This year will be the 10th annual Crawfish Boil on May the 27th. What will be different this year is we won't have the Godfather with us. At least not in person. So starting in 2018, the Pullman Lane Crawfish Boil is hereby renamed the Walter Coe Memorial Crawfish Boil. And we want you to join us. Dad, I hope you're enjoying all of us together, celebrating your life, and can feel all the love that we have for you. Your life was one that was so well lived and filled with love. You will be missed sorely, but never forgotten. I love you. And thank you for making me the man I am today. I'm so thankful that I had this kind, wonderful, and caring dad, who was the greatest grandfather ever. It's no coincidence that he was both an angel and a saint. And may you rest in wonderful peace. Thank you, guys.